Okay, it's 3:30 and I think it's time we get started. Thank you all for coming, braving this very ice cold, very cold weather. But I, I'm very appreciative of that. So today we have Dr. Kristen Carmichael. She's the founder and principal of Forest Consulting LLC. And I came to know that she has moved to East Lansing and has been living here. So she got her doctorate degree from MSU. So she's our alum. It's good to have our alums back and give talk. And then she did her master's in public affairs and environmental sciences from Indiana University. And then before that, she did her bachelor's from here as well. So we are very glad to welcome you. She'll be talking about, urban forest, equitable plan in urban forest. She recently had a book published, and that's the bestseller in Amazon right now.
It's a bestseller in 3 categories on Amazon. So
yeah,
check it out.
I will let you speak now.
Yeah.
Thank
you so much. I'll pass this around if you want to take a look. A lot of the things that I'm going to be, I guess, is am I unmuted on the Zoom? I'll pass this around, but this is just recently, I just published this book. It's my first book. And a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today, you'll see covered in more depth in the book. So I will pass this around for anyone who wants to look at it. And yeah, so I will also have a QR code up at the end of the talk with a link to the Amazon page. I would be selling the copies directly myself, but I haven't gotten the shipment yet. So if you do want it right now, it's on Kindle for $9.95 and then the paperback on Amazon for $19.95. So I will put that link up before we finish today. But yeah, so I'm Christine Carmichael. I did my PhD here at MSU. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But today, the topic is really about growing towards more equitable urban and community forestry practices. And I'll define what I mean by equitable. But just to give you a little introduction, I do have this consulting business, which I started in 2019 after I finished a postdoc at the University of Vermont. And it's really focused on trying to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in urban and community forestry. So what I did at Michigan State, this was about between 2013 and 2017. I studied reasons why residents in Detroit, Michigan, in mostly communities of color, are submitting no tree requests. And these are in low canopy communities, which I'll talk about in this presentation as well. And so these are areas where there's really not a lot of tree cover, and there could be some benefits from planting trees. But residents there basically said, no, I don't want the tree. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's the case. Yeah. Oh, got you. Okay, thank you. And so from that research, I found that a lot of the issues around why residents in low canopy communities would resist tree planting, those reasons were embedded in a lot of history that was applicable across the United States. And so the lessons from that research, I've been able to work as an equity and community engagement consultant, where I essentially advise cities, including Oakland, California, Holyoke, Massachusetts, and Ann Arbor, Michigan, on their urban forest management plans and how they can more equitably engage residents in planning and implementation of those plans. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why does urban tree canopy matter? What are the inequities or unequal nature, or what is the unequal nature of urban forest distribution now? And why are there urban tree inequities? And then where do we go from here? So just to kind of give you a little reference, to the top left corner, there's a picture from American Forests, and it says it's time for tree equity. And what they mean by that is that we currently, in some parts of the cities, you have a lot of tree cover. And those areas tend to be whiter and have higher income on average. And then there's other parts of the city that you have a lot less tree canopy coverage, far fewer trees. And that happens to be aligned with race and income as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all these things. But before I get into too much of that, I do want to kind of just talk with you really quickly about like, what do trees provide us? Why does it matter to have urban tree canopy coverage? So what are some of the things that you could think of? And this is the one little participation element of the presentation. But what do you all think trees provide, urban trees, throughout the year for us as humans? Any ideas? Health benefits. Yeah, any that come to mind? Yep. Yeah. Yeah, so she was saying there's a lot of physical and psychological health benefits from trees and air pollution mitigation, stormwater mitigation. Yes, and that's really important because as we're seeing climate change, the frontline communities, the communities that are most heavily impacted by things like severe storms and rainfall, are lower income communities and predominantly communities of color. So, and those are the areas where we have fewer trees, and trees could help with some of those things. Yeah, any other things that trees provide us that are important in urban areas? So not right now because it's winter, but a lot of times we think shade in the summer, right? And that can help with the health issues, but also, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm reading the chat and intersect stormwater, clean air, soil benefits, clean air inside cities.
Yes, clean air is one of those really big benefits that a lot of people think of when they think of trees in urban areas, because this is a lot of what you identified in this diagram, the Nature Conservancy. It does talk about it reduces air pollution, trees down here in the bottom left corner, by filtering out particulate matter, right? It also cools, the trees can cool cities by 2 to 4 degrees, reducing, this is again getting into the health benefits. Childhood asthma rates are highest where urban tree density is lowest. And we also know from statistics that children of color, especially African American children, are at a much higher prevalence of experiencing asthma. And that's usually because they're living in areas that are closer to pollution, air pollution, sources of air pollution and things like that. Trees, as the chat was saying, reduce stormwater runoff. And as I mentioned, that's really important, especially in lower income communities, as well as just historically disadvantaged communities, where you're getting more of that heavy rainfall. And then as well, we heard trees are known to relieve symptoms of depression, anxiety, ADD, and other behavioral disorders. So there's a lot of benefits from being around trees. I did just want to provide this diagram from Hawaii neighborhood forests as a comparison, because it talks sort of in more common language about some of the benefits. So you see reducing runoff, which protects the reef in Hawaii, and then lowering air conditioning usage and air conditioning bills, all of these things, bringing joy, things that might be even sometimes harder to measure, like joy, neighborhood walkability, things like that. But also a lot of times in the areas where you have fewer trees, you're also dealing with food deserts where people don't have access to high quality, nutritious food. So trees can be a source of fruit and things like that as well. But not everyone benefits equally from urban trees. There's a lot of really important recent research showing, this is from Philadelphia in 2019. You can see on one neighborhood, lots of trees. On the other side of the picture, a neighborhood with basically no trees. And there's a lot of research, including this study in Philly, that low-income neighborhoods have fewer trees, and the city's free tree program isn't helping. So that means that and we're going to sort of see why that's the case because of what happened in Detroit. There was a little bit of a lack of community engagement in these historically disadvantaged neighborhoods that have already experienced a lot of neglect and distrust in institutions. So there is a little bit of resistance to tree planting in these cases. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more. But basically, this holds true across the US. This quote really summarizes it well. The amount of greenery on your street depends on the amount of green in your pockets. And this is also, there's often less tree canopy cover in communities of color. And there's a link between this income piece and the racial piece as well, which I'm going to talk about. But this is just from one study, Schwartz and colleagues, showing the dark purple area on the map on the left is higher proportion of Black residents. And then on the right, you see the percentage of tree canopy coverage. Well, the darkest green areas that have the most tree canopy also have the fewest Black residents. And this is true also in Sacramento, California. You see here, the dark purple where you have more Black residents, lighter green, less tree canopy coverage. So why are there these tree inequities? There's essentially about 100-year-long history that we are all walking into that has affected the underlying reason why we have fewer trees in communities of color. So this is an important piece of history. From 1910 to 1970, over 6 million African Americans migrated from the South to the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West, aiming to try to escape racism, the threat of violence, and to seek jobs and educational opportunities in industrial cities. And you can see a lot of migration up to places like Detroit. I think this might have stopped working, but that's okay. But in places like Detroit, a lot of people were going for like the automobile industry, a lot of jobs in that industry, for instance. And this is a book called Black Boy from Richard Wright, who in 1945 published this book. And he was in the middle of this migration. And he said, I was leaving the South to fling myself into the unknown. I was taking a part of the South to transplant an alien soil, to see if it could grow differently, if it could drink of new and cool rains, bend in strange winds, respond to the warmth of other suns, and perhaps to bloom. Which is a beautiful, aspiration that he had. And unfortunately, a lot of African Americans were met with overtly racist policies and behaviors when they migrated. So you see these signs, this tract is exclusive and restricted, and this sign, which is from Detroit, saying we want white tenants in our white community. So what happened is in the 1930s, around the time of after the Great Depression, the federal government was trying to help families access mortgages for homes. And so they basically set up the Homeowners Loan Corporation to rate neighborhoods as undesirable or red, all the way up to green, which is highly desirable for places for mortgage lenders to invest in and to provide mortgages to people living in those areas. And low ratings, this is really important, were almost completely determined by race and ethnicity. So if there was a high percentage of people of color living in a neighborhood, it was automatically given a hazardous rating, regardless of how the neighborhood looked. And there's actually
question. Is there any advisor that can answer a quick question for me right now?
Oh, sorry, there was a question maybe?
Okay.
Or
Okay.
I don't know, maybe someone unmuted. Oh. So basically what happened was you had these low ratings, and that's where mortgage lenders invested. And new research from 2020 showed in 108 cities that those red line neighborhoods are often hotter than other neighborhoods in the same city. The most drastic difference you can see at the top is more than a 12-degree Fahrenheit surface temperature difference between the highest rated neighborhoods and the lowest rated neighborhoods. And this is a study from California showing that for emergency room visits, just to give you some sense of the proportions, our population is more like around 30 to 40% African American, but the percentage of emergency room visits for heat-related illness is 2/3 of that is Black and Hispanic almost, and then 53% Asian and only 27% white. And this is directly tied to the lack of tree canopy coverage. So this is actually a redlining map. You can see the areas that were marked as red, and then there's areas that are like yellow, which is like, oh, that's okay, and blue, and then the green were the highest rated areas. So across 37 cities in the US, the redlined areas, this is recent research, okay? Those redlined areas have 23% on average tree canopy coverage, whereas areas inhabited by white populations on average have 43% tree canopy coverage. So this is from Decker and Hall in 2021. I'm happy to provide any sources if anyone wants to look into this more. There's actually a really great source online for redlining. If you just Google mapping inequality, you'll be able to find a site that basically pulls up all the redlining maps. So this is a really important because what happened was when you had that great migration of African Americans to the South or from the South to other parts of the US, the response of white residents was to do white flight, which is fleeing to the suburbs and reinvesting their money there. And this is important for trees because trees are paid for, especially city trees, street trees, park trees, that is paid for by property taxes. Okay, so if you have people that are, you have this lack of investment in properties from the redlining, and then you have white flight where the people who had access to the most wealth were fleeing to the suburbs and reinvesting the money there. You can see here the 1960s was around the time that Detroit had a very, unfortunately famous for this race riot or race rebellion. And this is right in the time where you see sort of the dark blue is Metro Detroit, where you see the population spike, but the light blue line is the city of Detroit itself. So the population kind of hit a high of about 1.85 million in the 1950s. And this is when Detroit was known as the city of trees. They had more trees per capita than any other industrial city in the world. But you also then you had all this racial tension, and then the population of Detroit declined dramatically, but the proportion of African Americans went from 9% to over 85%. So everyone that was leaving the city was primarily white at that time. Okay, and that changed the racial demographic of the city and led to even more disinvestment of the trees in the city. So when money flees, the tree canopy declines. This is a picture from Detroit where it was the epicenter of Dutch elm disease, which was the first sort of really big disease to take out trees in Detroit. Detroit was also later in the 90s the epicenter for emerald ash borer. So you have all of these devastating things like emerald ash borer coming through, and you see from 1971 to 1984 the same street going from full canopy to very little canopy. The same thing here, Denver, Colorado, you can see on the left, in the Sun Valley neighborhood, 3% is the tree canopy coverage, and 94% of residents live in poverty. That's on the left. On the right, which is just a few miles away, they have a tree canopy coverage of 18%, and only 12% of residents live in poverty. So you see this connection between where money is concentrated and where are trees doing well. So then we have this issue where the tree canopy declines rapidly, right? And in the 1990s is when there was also federal government cut aid to municipalities. And in response, a lot of municipalities decreased or declined or basically got rid of, in some cases, their forestry departments. And in places like Detroit, they went through bankruptcy right around the time that I was doing this research about why people turn down trees. Detroit was going through bankruptcy, 2014. So the question became, there was these nonprofits popping up to plant trees because cities said, we don't have money for this. Why then would residents in these areas with very few trees that could benefit from trees turn down that offer? Why? So this was the question I was answering with my dissertation. What I found is that about 25% of residents that were eligible for a free street tree from the organization, the Greening of Detroit, which is a nonprofit, submitted a no tree request between this 3-year period, which was when they gave me access to their data for 2011 to 2014, which resulted in 1,800 plus trees not being planted. So why, and what could be done to address this issue? Well, I did interviews with the staff, with residents. I did a lot of qualitative community engaged research. I went to a lot of tree planting events, community meetings. I did surveys, interviews, focus groups, the whole 9 yards. So if you want to know any more about the methods, feel free to ask me. But what I found was that the number of trees planted was prioritized over dialogue with residents. So in community engagement, we're really concerned about how are people who are the most affected by an issue, how are the people most affected involved in the process? And in this case, I found out that the nonprofit, the Greening of Detroit, was putting the door hangers around in neighborhoods saying, we're going to plant a tree here. And here's the benefits of trees, and we'd like you to volunteer to help plant it. And then on top of that, the staff member said, well, we tend to do this door hanger distribution during a time of day we know people will not be home because of the amount of time it would take to actively engage in those conversations. So here what we have is when you switch funding from property taxes, which is a pretty stable source of income unless the city goes bankrupt, you switch that to then nonprofits doing most of the funding. The nonprofits are on a much more precarious funding system. So they're constantly trying to get money to plant trees, and the funders don't really necessarily want to fund the maintenance piece of things. And that turned out to be a huge problem. So these are pictures from Detroit. When I was doing my research, you can kind of see this huge branch that's fallen, a stump that hasn't been ground down, and then a tree that looks like it's been planted maybe in front of a vacant house that's not being very well cared for, and that's a more recent planting of a tree. And so one of the residents that I talked with who submitted a no tree request said, you know, I actually love trees. It makes things beautiful, it makes shade. There's no problem with trees. The problem is they have to be maintained. And in our neighborhood, they're not being maintained. So what we're seeing is the consequence of that disinvestment from redlining that has now gone over decades, right, of a lack of investment and trees not being cared for. They've become hazards for people. So a lot of people were concerned about accepting a new tree without having these maintenance issues taken care of and without really having any kind of answer. And it was a really big challenge. You can see this new tree is planted in front of these houses that are kind of in disrepair. You can see that people are dealing with a lot of overlapping issues economically. And so one of the staff members said, and I heard this a lot, I think it's really sexy to plant trees and fundable to plant trees, but not sexy to maintain or monitor those trees. And residents were thinking the same thing. They said, even though it's city property, we're going to end up having to care for it, raking leaves, and God knows whatever else we might have to do. And when I talked to residents, they said things like, I would like to, these are in neighborhoods where you had a high percentage, meaning a third of residents or more said no to a tree. And the average NTR neighborhoods is about where a quarter of residents said no. But these are areas where a decent number of people said no to a tree, and they still wanted to know things like, how do I care for the tree? Who can I contact if something is wrong? Who will care for the tree and how? And this is all the dialogue that was being avoided in the interest of trying to plant more trees as quickly as possible with a low staff capacity to do the community engagement piece. And 65% of residents that I interviewed wanted to have greater social interaction with the greening of Detroit when they came into neighborhoods. And some felt this could help engagement of young people. So where do we kind of go from here with all of this information? Well, we need to ground ourselves in environmental justice. And what does that really mean? It means the fair treatment and meaningful involvement. That's super important. Of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, programs, and policies. This is a really comprehensive definition, but essentially it's telling us everyone should have access to these environmental benefits, and everyone should be meaningfully involved in making decisions about it, about where we're going to plant trees and why. And this is a really great piece of art from Ricardo Levins Morales saying, nothing about us without us is for us. So the only way to achieve fair urban forestry is through what we call procedural justice. That's the meaningful inclusion in decision making. And the decisions we need to include people in range from, why are we planting trees in the first place? What are our goals? Maybe people in the neighborhood really want fruit trees for fruit. Maybe that's more of a priority than maybe planting trees that are going to grow larger and create the most shade possible. A lot of residents I talked with said, you know, I love shade, but we've had such bad experiences with these huge growing oak trees or other larger species that grow. We are really not interested in like those types of trees. We'd like to have more medium-sized, more manageable trees that still provide shade, but aren't going to be such a, you know, a kind of expensive thing to manage in the long run. And also, so not only our vision, we need to get people together and talk about why should we plant trees, what do they want, but also where should we plant trees first? The street trees, it's like every person gets their own tree, and people were saying, you know, actually, we'd prefer to have trees planted in the park because then we can manage it as a community and we all benefit as a community, rather than starting with the street trees, which then puts the onus on each individual homeowner to have to like take responsibility for that. So where are we planting trees? What species will be planted? Who will take care of the trees? And what support do residents need? And how can the city government and NGOs provide that support? So this is getting into like, what is equity? And basically what I've just presented to you is the top left picture. We have a tree that's leaning to the left. The fruit is falling to the person on the left. This is a metaphor for what we see now. There's more trees, more healthy trees in whiter areas where there's higher incomes. Those people are getting more of the benefits. Equality would tell us we'll just give everyone the same type of assistance, the same size ladder. Like anyone can call the 311 number and report an issue with trees, but we need more help in the communities that have been more neglected. So that's what equity means. Equity means custom tools like financial support for the tree planting and the tree care, technical guidance, helping residents pick these trees out, providing them with support, like if something's going wrong with the tree, we can come in and help diagnose it and treat it, equipment, physical labor. So everyone gets access to the custom tools and resources that they need to succeed in the collective goal of improving the urban forest. And then justice is ideally, in this case, the metaphor is straightening the tree, fixing the system so that we don't have to keep providing custom tools forever. Ideally, we fix the issue. We improve the tree canopy where it's low right now. And then we can kind of change the sizes of the ladders. So that's what we mean by equity. And this is from McDonough, who was my major advisor here at Michigan State. She retired right after I finished in 2017. And her colleagues, it's from the 90s, but I think it's really relevant today. This is like the spectrum of forestry efforts you can see in cities. So it's interesting because you start on the left with green guerrillas, which is basically bottom up. The community says, there was actually a story in Oakland, California, where they would go around throwing balloons filled with watermelon seeds on vacant property to just try to grow watermelons. And like, so there's all these stories of people just like taking it upon themselves to plant trees and not involving the professionals, which is not necessarily helpful, right? Because professionals have really important knowledge to help people make those decisions about trees. But we also don't want this fully top-down approach where the city and the nonprofits are making all these decisions without the residents, because then residents say, I don't want to participate in this. So what we're striving for is community-driven partnerships. It can be initiated by the professional forester, or it can be initiated by the community, but the key is shared decision-making. Okay, so we're sharing information with people so that they can be involved in making decisions, because I'm going to tell you right now, there's no one right way to improve the urban tree canopy. It doesn't mean that nonprofits don't have valuable resources and knowledge about which tree species would do better under a changing climate, but there's no one right answer. There's a lot of values we need to be balancing. So it's very important to involve the people that are being most closely affected so that they get on board with the program, and that will ultimately help the trees thrive because they're going to be cared for more. One example I really like here is the Garden of Healing Project, which is in New Haven, Connecticut. All of these women have lost their children to gun violence, and they approached the nonprofit Urban Resources Initiative to say, we want to create a garden of healing where people can go and reflect on this issue of the gun violence crisis, and also we can commemorate and have a memorial for the people we've lost. So the city said, that's great, we would love to help. They committed in-kind resources and raised funds from the state. There was gifts from a graduate of Yale and other philanthropies that provided matching funds, and an architectural firm helped to design the garden. So I love this quote from Colleen Murphy Dunning. She's the second to the right. She leads the Urban Resources Initiative. And she said, the process never fundamentally strayed from our community forestry model. It was their idea. They wanted to create the space, and they had the ownership, rights, and responsibilities that come with that. So it's not saying that, we give residents all the decision-making and no responsibility, because they do have responsibilities, but that means they should also have decision-making power. So one thing I'm going to go through, let's see what time we're at. We have some time. So I'm going to go through 7 of these kind of key steps that I would suggest if you're trying to help improve urban forest equity. These are some steps you can take, and these are steps that are sort of described in the book as well. But the first step is really to learn about the diversity of the population in your area. This is one resource called Policy Map. You can look up demographics, income, spending, housing, how many renters versus homeowners are in certain areas. And this helps you get to know where are those areas that are more likely going to need that support, where there's lower incomes, for instance. Another tool that recently came out is the Tree Equity Score Analyzer. You can go to the website, you can Google it. Basically, this score has been calculated for all 150,000 neighborhoods in urban areas across the US, in cities and nearby small towns that have at least 50,000 people. And I'll just show you this here. What it helps you do is to really look at what are the areas that have the fewest trees, and also they just need more help in general with their tree canopy. So I'm going to point at a few things here. This particular block that's in yellow has a score of 29 out of 100. And part of why that's the case is because they have 100% people of color living there, 87% of people living in poverty. The temperature is 86 degrees is the average surface temperature. And they have all of these other things like a health index. What are the other, health conditions that are prevalent here? And the current canopy is only 14%. So this is one of those areas you could look up where you live and see what is the tree equity score. Once you kind of identify what parts of the city might need more help, that's when you want to do what I did and identify these leaders in the community. In Detroit, there was a map that they created during the time I was there where they literally map out all of these grassroots community groups. So I can look at that and say, okay, this block club overlaps with a low canopy area. I should reach out to them. So this is you can go to church leaders, you can look for community groups, neighborhood associations, schools, youth organizations, anything that's within that low canopy area, and you can collaborate with them. Then you want to cultivate relationships and build trust. So the thing is that if you are living in a neighborhood that's been neglected historically and not treated very fairly, you're going to have a healthy dose of skepticism of any outsiders like myself that come in and are trying to quote unquote help. And really the most important thing is to be there to build relationships with people. So what I did was I volunteered at their community events. I helped make flyers for their community groups. If somebody had a tree issue, I gave them my business card, they called me, and I helped connect them to some services. So you have to have these longer term investments in a community. You can't expect people to be gung-ho about your program if you're just coming in and out one day, because they don't really know your true intentions. So I would encourage you to think about who you trust in your life and why, and how can you use that as knowledge to then build trust with other people. One thing that I did was collect heritage narratives, which are stories, histories about a community from the people that have lived there. So everyone has stories about the history of their community. Oftentimes it describes their relationships with institutions. Like a lot of people in Detroit said, I tried calling the city for years. They never came out. They never took care of the trees. And so that's a really big narrative that they're like, okay, I don't trust this new program. But understanding these stories can help you develop strategies for sustaining engagement. So people saying things like, I would trust you more if I saw your presence in the community more, if you came to our community meetings, etc. So in Detroit, I just want to point out the narrative around the race riots and all of the tension there, the white flight, led to a lot of people that were in the neighborhoods that stayed in the neighborhoods. A lot of Black residents started these block clubs to try to take care of problems that weren't being dealt with by the city. And so there's a huge neighborhood tradition in Detroit that we can tap into that already exists as infrastructure. And as a result, things like community land trusts, where we have homes that are available for people to become homeowners at an affordable rate. It protects houses from market-driven development. People are more interested in that. And if they get access to affordable home ownership, they're more likely to invest in the green space there. So it's just important to kind of be aware of these things. And I would really encourage asking open-ended questions, really going to residents, asking them, what have been your experiences with trees here? How would you like to be involved? I remember one group I helped to do some training for, and they were saying that there was a group of elderly women in the neighborhood that really wanted to be involved in the tree planting, but they physically couldn't. So instead, the women were designing these wraps to go around the trees, these artistic wraps that basically would kind of add some of the neighborhood's culture into the artwork, and it also protects the trees from like lawnmowers and things. So that was like one way they could still be involved without having to physically plant the trees themselves. So really thinking about how you could do this in your work. Instead of shying away from engagement, leaning into it more. I do want to leave time for questions. I just want to kind of point out what I saw in Detroit, unfortunately, a little bit was there was a lot of the nonprofit was doing a lot of trying to persuade or sell or tell people to accept what they were being offered just as it was. And residents were saying, no, I want to be involved in the decision about what type of tree are we planting, who's going to help care for it. So what that is we're trying to move from discussion and debate over to dialogue, where we're inquiring into our assumptions. Like the nonprofit said, well, we don't think people know how great trees are, the benefits of trees. So we're going to focus on educating people about the benefits of trees. But when I inquired into those assumptions, I asked residents who said no to a tree, I said, well, what do you think are the benefits of trees? And they would always list a lot of things, you know, shade, beauty, oxygen. And they said, it's not that I don't love trees, it's that this whole maintenance issue is just not being dealt with. And we don't really want to accept new things to take care of if we're not addressing these old issues. So that's where we're moving into dialogue, learning through inquiry and disclosure, and holding space for all perspectives. I don't want to spend too much time. I know how are we doing on time? We're okay? Okay, so I want to leave time for questions and things like that. But basically what I suggested is if you're going to do any kind of communication with residents, provide more detailed and relevant information to residents. Like residents want to know, what is the tree going to look like over time? What are the maintenance needs? All of that. And then we also wanted to have choices. Oh, I know one resident said, you know, even if it's just a choice out of 3 different types of trees, I'd like to have a choice. And it's a really important part of that ownership of what's happening in your neighborhood. Following up, let's broaden our indicators of success. So not just focusing on how many trees can we plant as quickly as possible, but how many residents, by doing more equitable engagement, are going to want to become involved in our program. And how many more residents, I've heard also training participants talk to me about how residents initially said, I don't want to be involved in maintenance, but then they saw the nonprofit come out taking care of the tree, and the resident would come out and say, oh, I kind of want to be involved in this. And so it may not happen the first time around, but kind of being invested over time and not expecting a miracle to happen overnight, but really putting in the time and effort. This is just if you work for an organization, it's really important to think about, you might have one person who does the community engagement, like lead on that, but everybody should have a role in supporting urban forest equity strategies. So I encourage people in these organizations to think about who's doing work related to equity, like trying to engage residents in dialogue, and how can other people in the organization support them? Like maybe the fundraising person finds more funding for the tree maintenance, and then that can get invested into the community to address a community identified issue. So it's really important to think of this as a system. And then the last couple of things here, I always advise to implement interactive community outreach programs. This is an example of the community green space program. It's implemented by Esmeralda, you see here, but she's gotten support from the Community Foundation, the City of New Haven, the Yale School of Forestry. This is really where we need to move in terms of types of engagement. We can't just be putting door hangers on doors and telling people you should love what we're offering. We need to provide ways for people to learn and then participate in the decision making. So this is one thing they've done is they've set up tours of the other green space sites so that people can see what's possible on their site. They've set up visits to local parks. They've provided print media like gardening magazines as to offer inspiration. So these are all things you can do even just as starting points to more engaged, more equitable, more fair urban forestry. This is from Holyoke, Massachusetts. I was involved as an advisor in the community engagement plan process for this plan. This is, to my knowledge, the first ever urban forest equity plan in the US. And these were the things we basically went to those community leaders that we identified in the low canopy neighborhoods, and we asked them what are the best ways to engage with people here. So we had a dedicated website, we had media outreach, postcards, we had virtual community forums on Zoom and Facebook Live because residents in that neighborhood, it was mostly Hispanic residents, so we did everything in Spanish and English. And then we also, Facebook Live, they told us that's what you're going to get more participation on, not Zoom. So, and then we did all the different things you could do, the online surveys, the print copies of surveys. We had tablets at the grocery store so people could fill out the survey there, really taking down those barriers to engaging with people. And this is just one example, and we put this call for selfies out on the city's social media pages and said, take a picture in front of your favorite tree and tell us why. And then we put these in, they were entered into a contest, they could win a gift card to the grocery store. And we basically posted and we put these pictures throughout the whole plan so that it was the residents that were front and center, not the city or the nonprofits. And so this was Fernando. He said, this is my favorite tree because this is the first place I visited in Holyoke after Hurricane Maria in 2017. This is the first tree I saw with this beautiful color, the first time I saw it in real life. So this is just a really interactive, easy way to kind of understand what are people's values towards trees and how can we help them achieve those values. This is a place where he's mentioning Hurricane Maria because a lot of Puerto Rican immigrants have moved to Holyoke, and Hurricane Maria heavily affected Puerto Rico during that time. The last thing I'll say is it's very important to monitor any plans or any activities and make sure it's going well and follow up, build that trust. So really now in the day and age we live in with COVID and everything, it's important to provide regular both in-person and virtual updates. You can have regular standing community meetings, which helps to build social cohesion as well. You can have neighborhood-based governance bodies, and you can pay people in the communities to meet. And this is what you can advocate for funding for, is to pay residents to do the outreach to their own neighbors and also to basically be involved in the decision-making process. So it's not just asking them to do free labor. So this is, and we need to measure more than just trees and survival. So the last thing I'll say here, we need to go from just numbers of trees planted to how many trees are we planting that fulfill values that are important to our residents? How many trees are planted in locations that are desired and agreed upon by the residents? How many additional residents are seeking to become involved because the process is more inclusive? Tree survivability and health, that's fine. We need to track that, but we also need to track whether we're developing collaborative stewardship plans, how many residents and foresters are doing the monitoring and stewardship, And how responsive are we? Like even keeping a spreadsheet when residents report concerns, how responsive and how quick are you to respond to that is important. Not just the number of volunteers on planting days, but we need to measure how many actual residents are engaged before, during, and after. And not just the nonprofit and funder satisfaction with tree planting, but how satisfied are the residents with the tree planting process and outcomes? How much social cohesion are we developing because we're doing a more engaged process? So those are the 7. Like I said, I adapted from the Forest Service. They had this publication, and this is also integrating the things that I've done. So these are those strategies. I'll keep up on the screen. If you're interested in any more of, what I talked about today, it's probably in greater depth in the book that I just wrote and just published. So feel free to use the QR code if you would like to purchase the book. And I'll go back to that in a second. But yeah, that's me and that's my time. So I hope it was interesting, and I'd love to take any questions. Yes.
So great talk. And I'm just I love all your work, and just reflecting on the work that you said you did in Ann Arbor, Holyoke, and Oakland in terms of helping develop the urban forest management plans. And so I'm curious about what were the similarities and differences between those communities or among those communities with respect to how they're prioritizing equity, and in terms of some of the heritage narratives that came out you were engaged with.
Yeah. So what are some of the similarities and differences? That's really good. So Oakland was developing their first ever urban forest master plan, and they were doing a 50-year vision. And because it was the first time they had done this, and they were kind of like walking into a history of trees being neglected, and this was the first time that really the city in a long time had tried to engage residents. So there was a healthy dose of skepticism. So the community engagement process took a lot longer, because it took more time to develop the relationships with the community groups for them to want to then be like, okay, I'll help you reach out to residents. I'll help you do. And so I think that because it was like a first ever, and it was trying to be a 50-year vision, it took a lot longer on the community engagement, and there had to be a lot more work on the relationship building side first. Whereas, so in Ann Arbor, it was a revision to their existing urban forest management plan. The thing that was really hard in Ann Arbor is that they had a lot of usual suspects that were tended to be older white gentlemen and things like that were involved in forestry. But it was really hard to reach out to more diverse audiences. And so we developed a steering committee, and we intentionally did like a wide call for applicants. And we intentionally said, we're looking for people who have never been involved. That's like a criteria, because sometimes people won't apply because they're like, oh, well, I don't have experience. They're probably looking for someone with experience. And so we made it very explicit that we were looking for people who had never been involved, but were interested in urban forestry, and they came from underserved or historically marginalized backgrounds, so either race, gender, and all of those qualities, renters, income. And they really helped advise us on the community engagement strategies. Holyoke was in the height of the pandemic, so we really couldn't do any in-person engagement very well, and that hindered a lot of things. But we tried instead to sort of have a smaller committee of community leaders from the neighborhood who could then go do the in-person at the grocery store, or they would give us suggestions like the Facebook Live, or we would ask them like, what kind of incentive should we give people for the call for selfies? And they were like, give them a grocery store certificate. So there was a lot of like variation just in like what we were already walking into. And I would say Oakland kind of was the least developed. So that took a lot more time. And yeah, in Ann Arbor, they also had this separate initiative called the 10,000 Trees, I think, initiative. And they were focusing on like one neighborhood, the Bryant neighborhood, that was underserved. But it was already like going on. And so it was kind of like tangential to the planning that we were doing. But I think that the goal was to try to learn from them and integrate that. But anyway, so yeah, there was a lot of kind of variation. Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for some more questions if anybody has any. Yes.
Great. It's very interesting about the building. I'm curious about the
the programs, a lot of the programs and the plans that you talk about seem to rely to some extent on the assumption of home ownership.
Mm,
But there's a lot of home ownership and stewardship that falls on the person that actually owns the property. And of course, the neighborhoods that are underserved and have low canopy levels are disproportionately comprised of renters.
mhm.
And that's probably used to.
Yeah.
So it's curious if that came up in interviews at all. Or if there are ways that these programs are developing or being more flexible to adapt to more renters.
Yeah, so the question was about, dealing with the fact that you have renters a lot of times in these low canopy neighborhoods and they don't have a lot of power or authority over what happens with the trees. So one thing that I do also in addition to helping with these plans is that I do online training, virtual training series for the Arbor Day Foundation. They have this Alliance for Community Trees, which is comprised of nonprofits all across the country. And so I do these virtual trainings, and one of the groups, Trees Upstate, which is in South Carolina, they explicitly serve the role of partnering with like housing developments. And they're the ones that go directly to whoever's the property manager or the property owner. They figure that out. They either find the sign for the community development. They ask the residents, like, who's your landlord? And they initiate and get the permission of the landlord to engage the residents in the process. So not just getting permission to plant trees, but actually getting permission to do this engagement process with the residents, let the residents pick out their tree. And so when the nonprofit then goes to the residents and the residents are like, well, I have no power, I can't make this. Actually, we already got permission from your landlord. And then they're like, wow, okay. And even if they say, well, why should I be involved? Because I'm a renter, this isn't my property. It's like, but you live here, and it's your view from your window. And so they use a lot of ownership language at that point to try to help people who are renters feel a sense of ownership and be, not feel discouraged from being involved in the process just because they're not a homeowner. And I mean, it's, you don't always get a yes. Like this woman that I work with, Evangeline Costa at Trees Upstate, is amazing, but she's gotten no's from some property management companies that are like, I don't care, I don't want it. But most often they're like, sure, that's interesting. So I think there's a really unique role that these nonprofits can play, and they're starting to do that to try to ease those conversations and get renters more involved.
Have you seen that at all with cities as well? Like I'm just thinking, I just filled out a tree planting request with the city of Wisconsin, and I rented previously, and it never would have occurred to me that that was a process that I potentially really could engage in. Have you seen any of that with the
cities? I have not seen that yet with the cities. And I don't know if there's legal questions around like what the city can or can't do, but I wouldn't think that it would prevent them from doing that. I just haven't seen it myself yet. I've only seen nonprofits doing it. Yeah, absolutely.
More questions?
Yes.
So just thinking about like your work in Detroit, like with Detroit being a predominantly Black city.
Yeah.
There's not as much racial heterogeneity as you might see in different cities, but there's a lot of class variation.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm curious if you saw any variation in how folks responded to the tree planting based on the wealth of some of these predominantly Black neighborhoods, and thinking about like folks in Palmer Woods versus like somewhere off the 7 Mile side.
Yeah, well, what I did find is in the neighborhoods where the trees, in the kind of nicer neighborhoods that were still higher proportion Black residents, they were saying, they were more likely to accept the tree because they said, yeah, the city came by, I had a tree issue, they took care of it. So they had better experiences, like maybe because their neighborhood was more like, I guess, hadn't been as downtrodden or had gone through as much economic decline. They were in these parts of the city where they said, yeah, I had a great experience, so I'm happy to accept a new tree. And you definitely saw a different reaction in neighborhoods where, again, the racial composition is the same, but the income levels and the proportion of vacant properties is different. And so the areas where I saw more vacant properties, residents were basically like, there was one elderly man in one neighborhood who was being paid by the widows, the other women in the neighborhood, to mow the lawns of like 6 vacant properties, just to make sure that it didn't get overgrown. And I mean, that wasn't his job, you know, it wasn't his responsibility, but the city or whoever was in charge of those vacant properties was not maintaining them. And so they kind of were like, well, we're already kind of having to take up the slack of services we're not getting. And so in those situations, and you definitely saw a lot more like hesitance and like, let's pause on planting more trees. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
It's one online.
Oh yeah, Jasmine, great.
I'm a forestry PhD student here that's also studying the connection between race, culture, history, and forests. I wanted to ask if you had identified an alternative model to property taxes versus NGOs in terms of funding urban forestry efforts. Is there another option? Only because I know NGOs, like you said, do not have stable funding traditionally.
Yeah, you know, the only thing that I've seen that I thought was kind of promising was there's a tree resilience program, which has been piloted in St. Louis and I think Chicago. And I don't think they got additional funding from the federal government with the most recent round of funding. But what they did, it was a partnership with the Forest Service, the nonprofits, and private sector like Davy Resource Group or Davy Expert Tree Company. And they basically secured the funding to take care of dead hazardous tree removals in these specific neighborhoods that had been underserved. And so, you know, outside of, I guess, so they weren't using property taxes, and it wasn't just the NGO. It was a lot of like the Forest Service and the private sector coming together with the NGO to get the funding and identify. The NGO in that situation was more responsible for the engagement of the residents and identifying who would benefit from the program. And then these other partners provided more of like the funding and technical support. So that's the only kind of example, but treesilience.org is the website. You can look at that. That's the only kind of example I can think of. And I know we just got this huge federal investment into urban forestry, which is great. I don't know if that's necessarily a sustainable approach, because you never know what's going to happen the next funding cycle with federal government. So, yeah, it's a great question. I think it's to be determined how to best address some of these things where it's not an easy answer, right? You can't just change the economic situation in Detroit overnight and get all this property tax revenue, et cetera. So it is going to take a lot of creative thinking. I think the wood reuse programs are partly going to be a thing where we create employment opportunities and things. And yeah, I'm kind of going on, so I'll stop. But yeah, that's what I was going to share. So yeah, I think we're at time, but yeah, thank you so much for everyone who came out today. I know it's super cold and not nice out. So and all of those who join online as well. I'm happy to, I'll put my email in the chat if anybody wants to follow up by email. And there we go.
Okay, thank you, Carmichael, for this.
Yeah.